Maya Chen thought she knew what humiliation felt like. She'd weathered public rejections, failed job interviews, and the particular sting of being the overlooked middle child in a family obsessed with appearances. But nothing prepared her for the moment her sister Victoria held up her engagement ring at Sunday dinner and declared it looked like something from a gas station vending machine. The laughter that followed from their parents still echoed in Maya's ears 3 days later. But what came next would silence that laughter forever and reveal a truth that would shatter everything the Chen family thought they knew about worth, legacy, and the quiet woman they'd spent years dismissing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ring had been her grandmother's final gift, pressed into Maya's palm during those last fragile weeks when Nine-Eye's voice had become whispers, and her once strong hands trembled like autumn leaves. It wasn't much to look at, Maya had to admit. The metal had a peculiar warmth to it, almost bronze in certain light. Definitely not the brilliant white gold or platinum that Victoria's collection of jewelry demanded. The stone itself seemed modest, catching light in unexpected ways, but never with the flashy brilliance of the diamonds that adorned her sister's fingers like trophies from a conquest Maya had never been invited to join. Maya had worn the ring every day since Nine-Eye's funeral 2 years ago, twisting it absently during long meetings at the nonprofit where she worked, finding comfort in its weight during the sleepless nights when grief arrived uninvited. It had become part of her, as essential as breathing, as familiar as the scar on her thumb from the time she'd tried to help her grandmother in the kitchen, and learned that love sometimes came with small wounds that healed into permanent reminders. The Chen family Sunday dinners were supposed to be sacred gatherings, a tradition their mother Helen insisted upon with the fervor of someone desperate to maintain the illusion of closeness. Every week, Maya drove 40 minutes from her modest apartment in the Arts District to the sprawling house in Westfield Heights, where she'd grown up feeling like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. The house itself was a monument to success, all clean lines and expensive furniture arranged with the precision of a showroom, each surface gleaming under carefully positioned lights that never quite reached the corners where imperfections might hide. Victoria had arrived that particular Sunday with her usual fanfare, her heels clicking against the marble entryway like a countdown to some inevitable performance. She was freshly engaged to Bradley Whitman, heir to a shipping fortune, and the kind of man their parents had been grooming Victoria to attract since she was old enough to understand that marriage was just another form of strategic alliance. The engagement ring she wore was everything Maya's wasn't. Ostentatious, impossible to ignore, a 3-carat diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught every available photon and threw it back with aggressive sparkle. Maya's youngest sister, Jessica, had been there too, 22 and still golden from a semester studying abroad in Monaco, her conversation peppered with casual mentions of princes and polo matches, as if such things were as common as grocery shopping. Jessica wore their grandmother's pearl earrings, the ones Nine-Eye had specifically mentioned wanting her to have, though Maya couldn't remember when that decision had been made or why she hadn't been part of the conversation. The dinner had proceeded with its usual choreography of performance and judgment. Helen Chen commanded the table with the efficiency of a conductor, orchestrating conversations that highlighted Victoria's engagement planning, Jessica's upcoming graduation from an Ivy League school, and their father David's latest business acquisition. Maya's work at the Riverside Community Foundation helping. Maya Chen thought she knew what humiliation felt like. She'd weathered public rejections, failed job interviews, and the particular sting of being the overlooked middle child in a family obsessed with appearances. But nothing prepared her for the moment her sister Victoria held up her engagement ring at Sunday dinner and declared it looked like something from a gas station vending machine. The laughter that followed from their parents still echoed in Maya's ears 3 days later, but what came next would silence that laughter forever and revealed a truth that would shatter everything the Chen family thought they knew about worth, legacy, and the quiet woman they'd spent years dismissing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ring had been her grandmother's final gift, pressed into Maya's palm during those last fragile weeks when Nai-Nai's voice had become a whisper's and her once strong hands trembled like autumn leaves. It wasn't much to look at, Maya had to admit. The metal had a peculiar warmth to it, almost bronze in certain light, definitely not the brilliant white gold or platinum that Victoria's collection of jewelry demanded. The stone itself seemed modest, catching light in unexpected ways, but never with the flashy brilliance of the diamonds that adorned her sister's fingers like trophies from a conquest Maya had never been invited to join. Maya had worn the ring every day since Nai-Nai's funeral 2 years ago, twisting it absently during long meetings at the nonprofit where she worked, helping find comfort in its weight during the sleepless nights when grief arrived uninvited. It had become part of her, as essential as breathing, as familiar as a scar on her thumb from the time she'd tried to help her grandmother in the kitchen, and learned that love sometimes came with small wounds that healed into permanent reminders. The Chen family Sunday dinners were supposed to be sacred gatherings, a tradition their mother Helen insisted upon with the fervor of someone desperate to maintain the illusion of closeness. Every week, Maya drove 40 minutes from her modest apartment in the Arts District to the sprawling house in Westfield Heights, where she'd grown up feeling like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. The house itself was a monument to success, all clean lines and expensive furniture arranged with the precision of a showroom, each surface gleaming under carefully positioned lights that never quite reached the corners where imperfections might hide. Victoria had arrived that particular Sunday with her usual fanfare, her heels clicking against the marble entryway like a countdown to some inevitable performance. She was freshly engaged to Bradley Whitman, heir to a shipping fortune, and the kind of man their parents had been grooming Victoria to attract since she was old enough to understand that marriage was just another form of strategic alliance. The engagement ring she wore was everything Maya's wasn't. Ostentatious, impossible to ignore, a 3-carat diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught every available photon and threw it back with aggressive sparkle. Maya's younger sister, Jessica, had been there too, 22 and still golden from a semester studying abroad in Monaco, her conversation peppered with casual mentions of princes and polo matches, as if such things were as common as grocery shopping. Jessica wore their grandmother's pearl earrings, the ones Nai-Nai had specifically mentioned wanting her to have, though Maya couldn't remember when that decision had been made or why she hadn't been part of the conversation. The dinner had proceeded with its usual choreography of performance and judgment. Helen Chen commanded the table with the efficiency of a conductor, orchestrating conversations that highlighted Victoria's engagement planning, Jessica's upcoming graduation from an Ivy League school, and their father, David's latest business acquisition. Maya's work at the Riverside Community Foundation.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Hand, letting the overhead chandelier catch her engagement ring's facets and scatter light across the dining room walls like accusations. The comparison was devastating in its obviousness. Victoria's ring commanded attention, demanded recognition, announced its worth to anyone within viewing distance. Maya's ring seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its surface holding secrets rather than broadcasting them. Next to the aggressive brilliance of Victoria's diamond, Maya's stone looked cloudy, uncertain, apologetic for taking up space. "You know what?" Helen said with the tone of someone delivering a merciful solution. "Why don't we take it to Harrison's tomorrow? They do appraisals, and then you'll know for certain what you're dealing with. Sometimes family stories get a bit embellished over time." Harrison's Jewelry was the kind of establishment that the Chen family had been shopping for decades, the sort of place where your credit was established by your surname rather than your bank account. Victoria had selected her engagement ring there, Jessica's graduation watch had come from their vintage collection, and Helen's anniversary pieces were all Harrison originals, each one a checkpoint in the family's steady climb toward irreversible respectability. Maya wanted to refuse, wanted to stand up from the table and walk away from the whole performance. But she could see the trap closing around her. If she declined the appraisal, it would be taken as admission that she knew the ring was worthless and was clinging to a delusion. If she agreed, she would be subjecting herself to public humiliation when Harrison's confirmed what everyone already believed, that she was wearing a piece of costume jewelry and trying to pass it off as something precious. "Fine," she said finally, the word feeling like surrender. "We can get it appraised." Victoria clapped her hands together with the delight of someone who just won a game she'd been playing alone. "Perfect! This will be so educational for you, Maya. You'll learn to recognize quality, and then you can start making better choices." The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of conversation that carefully avoided any mention of the ring, as if the subject had been resolved and filed away under minor family embarrassments successfully addressed. Maya pushed food around her plate while Victoria regaled the table with stories about wedding venue tours and dress fittings, each detail another reminder of the life Maya wasn't living, the standards she apparently wasn't meeting. When Maya finally escaped to her car, she sat in the driveway for 20 minutes, staring at the ring on her finger and trying to understand why its appearance had never bothered her before. Under the harsh interior light of her sedan, she had to admit that Victoria wasn't entirely wrong. The band did look strange, darker than gold but warmer than silver, with tiny marks etched into the metal that could have been decorative or could have been signs of age and wear. The stone itself was unlike anything she'd seen in jewelry store windows. Substantial, but not flashy, with depths that seemed to shift depending on the angle of observation. She thought about her grandmother's stories, the ones Nine-Eye had told during those long afternoons when Maya would visit, bringing groceries and staying for tea that always stretched into hours of conversation. Nine-Eye had talked about the old country, about leaving everything behind except what could be sewn into coat linings or hidden in the soles of shoes. She'd spoken about jewelry that was more than decoration, pieces that carried history and held family secrets in their settings. But those had always seemed like the embellished stories of an elderly woman trying to make her past sound more romantic than it had been. Maya had listened with the affectionate patience of someone humoring a beloved relative, never imagining that the worn ring being pressed in her palm might be anything more than a sweet gesture from a grandmother who wanted her middle grandfather to have something, anything, that belonged to her.
Specifically to her. The drive home was 40 minutes of second-guessing and self-doubt, every mile adding weight to the possibility that her family was right and she'd been carrying around a piece of worthless metal while imagining it connected her to something meaningful. By the time she reached her apartment, Maya had almost convinced herself that the appraisal would be a relief, a way to finally put to rest any delusions about her place in the family hierarchy or her connection to whatever legacy the Chen family actually possessed. The next morning arrived with the particular dread that comes with knowing you've agreed to your own humiliation. Maya called in sick to work, spending the hours before the appointment staring at the ring and trying to prepare herself for the moment when a professional would confirm what Victoria had announced with such confidence, that she'd been wearing costume jewelry and mistaking it for something precious. Harrison's jewelry occupied a corner building in the heart of the financial district, its windows displaying pieces that commanded respect and required appointments for serious consideration. Maya had been there before for family occasions, always as an observer, while Victoria or Jessica tried on pieces that cost more than Maya's annual salary. The staff knew the Chen family by name, greeting Helen and her daughters with the particular warmth reserved for customers whose purchases funded vacation homes and private school tuitions. Maya arrived 15 minutes early and spent the time walking around the block, trying to summon the courage to enter a building where her inadequacy was about to be professionally quantified. When she finally pushed through the heavy glass doors, the familiar weight of polite exclusion settled over her like a coat she'd worn too many times. Victoria was already there, holding court with Helena Harrison, the owner's daughter who'd taken over much of the family business and who treated jewelry appraisals with the solemnity of a religious ceremony. Victoria had positioned herself as the concerned sister, the one responsible enough to ensure that family heirlooms were properly understood and appropriately valued. "Maya, darling, perfect timing," Victoria called out with the kind of enthusiasm that made Maya's stomach clench. "Helena was just telling me about their new authentication equipment. They can tell you everything about a piece: age, origin, composition, market value. It's fascinating." Helena Harrison was a woman in her 50s who wore her expertise like armor. Each piece of jewelry on her body a statement about her ability to recognize and appreciate true quality. She greeted Maya with professional courtesy, but Maya could see the assessment happening, the quick evaluation that placed her somewhere below the threshold of serious consideration. "So this is the piece in question," Helena said, gesturing toward Maya's hand, with the same tone she might use to discuss a minor inconvenience. "May I?" Maya reluctantly extended her hand, watching as Helena slipped the ring from her finger with the practiced efficiency of someone who handled thousands of pieces each year. The ring looked even smaller in Helena's palm, more obviously flawed under the bright lights of the jewelry store's examination area. "Interesting," Helena murmured, turning the ring slowly in her hand. Her expression shifted slightly, professional detachment giving way to something that might have been surprise. "The setting is quite unusual, and the stone—" She reached for a jeweler's loupe, fitting it against her eye as she brought the ring closer to the light. The examination stretched longer than Maya had expected. Helena's initial confidence seemed to evaporate as she studied the piece with increasing intensity, occasionally setting it down to consult reference books or pulling out different magnification tools. Victoria grew visibly impatient, checking her phone and shifting in her chair as the minutes accumulated without the quick dismissal she'd been anticipating. "Is there a problem?" Victoria finally asked, voice carrying just enough irritation to remind everyone that her time was valuable, and this exercise was meant to be brief and conclusive. Helena didn't answer immediately. She'd moved to a different workstation, one equipped with what appeared to be sophisticated testing equipment. Maya watched as her ring was subjected to various examinations, each one seeming to deepen Helena's concentration rather than resolve whatever question had initially caught her attention. "Helena?" Victoria's voice was sharper now, the first hint of uncertainty creeping into her previously confident demeanor. "I'm going to need to run a few more tests," Helena said without looking up from the microscope she was using to examine the stone. "This is, well, it's not what I initially expected." Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach, though she couldn't tell if it was relief or terror. "What do you mean?" Helena finally looked up, her expression careful and professional, but lacking the dismissive certainty Maya had been bracing herself to receive. "The metal isn't what it appears to be. It's not brass or bronze as I first thought. And this stone—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I'm gonna need to bring in a specialist." Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on glass. "A specialist? Helena, come on. It's obviously costume jewelry. Just tell us what it's worth so we can move on." "Mrs. Whitman," Helena said, using Victoria's married name with the kind of formality that suggested professional distance was being established, "I've been in this business for 30 years. I've seen everything from priceless heirlooms to convincing fakes. This piece, it's not behaving like anything I've encountered before." The words hung in the air between them, heavy, with implications that Maya didn't dare to interpret. Maya watched Victoria's face cycle through confusion, irritation, and something that might have been the first whisper of doubt. The appointment that was supposed to last 20 minutes had stretched past an hour, and instead of the quick resolution Victoria had orchestrated, they were facing the possibility that nothing about this situation was as simple as it had seemed. "What does that mean, exactly?" Maya asked, her voice smaller than she'd intended. Helena set the ring down carefully, as if it were something that might break or explode if handled roughly. "It means I need to call in Dr. Patricia Valdez. She's a gemologist who specializes in unusual stones and historical pieces. She'll be able to give us a definitive analysis." "How long will that take?" Victoria demanded, though her earlier confidence had clearly been shaken by the unexpected turn the appointment had taken.
She can be here this afternoon if I explain the situation, Helena replied, already reaching for her phone. In the meantime, I'd recommend that this piece be kept secure. If it's what I'm beginning to suspect it might be. She didn't finish the sentence, but Maya felt the weight of unspoken possibilities settling around her like fog rolling in from the ocean. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than a simple appraisal, more complicated than the family drama that had brought them here. Maya found herself staring at the ring on Helena's workbench, this simple band of metal and stone that had somehow transformed from an object of family ridicule into something that required specialists and security precautions. Victoria was quiet on the drive back to Maya's apartment, her usual stream of commentary replaced by a silence that felt more unsettling than any criticism she had ever delivered. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note Maya had never heard before: uncertainty disguised as authority. "You realize this doesn't change anything," Victoria said as they sat at a red light. "Even if it turns out to be worth something, which is highly unlikely, it doesn't make you any less, different from the rest of us." But Maya could hear the doubt underneath the words, the first crack in the certainty that had always defined Victoria's relationship with the world around her. For the first time, in her adult life, Maya found herself in possession of something that couldn't be easily categorized, dismissed, or explained away. Whatever happened when Dr. Valdez examined the ring, it would happen to a Maya who had already been changed by the simple act of being taken seriously by an expert, of having her grandmother's gift treated as something worthy of professional curiosity rather than family ridicule. The afternoon stretched ahead of them, heavy with possibility and the kind of anticipation that comes with knowing that everything you thought you understood about your place in the world might be about to change. Maya touched her finger where the ring usually sat, surprised by how naked her hand felt without its familiar weight, and wondered if she was ready for whatever truth was waiting to be revealed under Dr. Valdez's examination. As they pulled into her apartment complex, Maya realized that regardless of the ring's actual value, something fundamental had already shifted. She was no longer the overlooked sister with questionable judgment and embarrassing taste in jewelry. She was someone whose grandmother's gift had required specialists and security measures, someone whose story was still being written rather than already concluded. And for the first time in years, Maya found herself curious about what the next chapter might contain. Dr. Patricia Valdez arrived at Harrison's Jewelry with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades uncovering secrets that precious stones preferred to keep hidden. She was a compact woman in her early 60s, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun that suggested her priorities lay entirely with function over form. Her leather satchel contained instruments Maya had never seen before, devices that looked more suited to a laboratory than a jewelry store, each one designed to coax truth from objects that had learned to lie convincingly about their origins. Maya had returned to the store with Victoria, though the dynamic between the sisters had shifted in ways neither of them fully understood. Victoria's earlier confidence had been replaced with a brittle cheerfulness that seemed to require constant maintenance, while Maya found herself occupying unfamiliar territory somewhere between anxiety and anticipation. The ring sat in Helena's secured examination area, waiting under bright lights like a defendant preparing for trial. "I understand we have something of a mystery here," Dr. Valdez said, settling herself at the workstation with the methodical precision of someone beginning a ritual she'd performed thousands of times. Her accent carried traces of her native Colombia, softened by decades in academic circles, but still adding warmth to her professional demeanor. Helena briefly explained the morning's unexpected developments, how what should have been a routine appraisal had instead revealed inconsistencies that defied her considerable experience. Dr. Valdez listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as she unpacked her equipment with movements that spoke of long familiarity with the process of revelation. "Before we begin," Dr. Valdez said, looking directly at Maya, "I need you to understand that sometimes we discover things that challenge our assumptions about family history, about the stories we've been told. Are you prepared for the possibility that this ring might not be what you've believed it to be?"
Maya felt Victoria shift beside her, a movement that seemed to carry relief at the suggestion that the ring might be exposed as fraudulent after all. But Maya found herself nodding slowly, surprised by her own certainty. "I'm ready to know the truth." Dr. Valdez smiled, the expression transforming her serious features into something almost maternal. "Good. The truth is always worth knowing, even when it's uncomfortable." She lifted the ring with tweezers, holding it up to catch the light streaming through the store's windows. "Now, let's see what secrets you've been keeping." The examination began with visual assessment, Dr. Valdez studying the ring through various magnifications while making notes in a leather-bound journal
That looked older than Maya herself. She photographed the piece from multiple angles, each flash of the camera capturing details that seemed invisible to casual observation. "The craftsmanship is immediately apparent," Dr. Valdez murmured, more to herself than to her audience. "The setting shows techniques that fell out of common use decades ago. The metalwork is exceptional, far beyond what you'd find in commercial jewelry, even expensive pieces." She moved to chemical testing, applying tiny drops of solution to inconspicuous areas of the band and observing the reactions with the intensity of a scientist discovering new elements. Each test seemed to deepen her concentration rather than resolve her questions, and Maya could see Victoria growing increasingly agitated beside her. "What exactly are you testing for?" Victoria finally interrupted, her voice carrying the particular strain of someone trying to maintain control over a situation that was rapidly escaping her influence. "Everything," Dr. Valdez replied without looking up from her work. "Metal composition, age indicators, signs of treatment or enhancement, geographical markers that might indicate origin. This stone is particularly intriguing because it's exhibiting properties that are—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Unusual for pieces in this price range." "What price range?" Maya asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Dr. Valdez set down her instruments and looked at Maya with an expression that seemed equal parts excitement and concern. "That's what we're trying to determine. But I can tell you that this is definitely not costume jewelry. The metal is a gold alloy, quite pure, with trace elements that suggest European origins. The craftsmanship indicates significant skill and expense in the creation." Victoria made a sound that might have been skepticism or might have been something closer to panic. "But it looks so ordinary. I mean, if it were valuable, wouldn't it be more obviously beautiful?" "Beauty is subjective," Dr. Valdez said gently, "but quality is measurable. Sometimes the most valuable pieces are designed to be understated, to reveal their worth only to those who know how to look properly." She returned her attention to the ring, beginning a new series of tests that involved instruments Maya couldn't identify. The stone itself proved to be the greatest source of mystery. Under various lights and magnifications, it seemed to shift and change, revealing depths and inclusions that created patterns Dr. Valdez described as architecturally impossible and geometrically fascinating. She spent nearly an hour photographing the stone's interior, occasionally calling Helena over to confirm observations that seemed to surprise even her experienced eye. "This is remarkable," Dr. Valdez said finally, leaning back from the microscope with an expression of someone who had just solved a puzzle they hadn't expected to encounter. "The stone is natural, definitely not synthetic, but it's unlike anything in my reference materials. The inclusions form patterns that suggest formation under very specific geological conditions, possibly in volcanic environments with unusual mineral compositions." She turned to a computer, pulling up databases and reference materials that seemed to contain every precious stone that had ever been cataloged. Maya watched as screen after screen of images flickered past, Dr. Valdez searching for matches that never quite materialized.
The closest comparisons I can find are to stones that have come out of very specific regions, Dr. Valdez said, her voice taking on the careful tone of someone delivering news that might not be entirely welcome. Primarily from mines that were exhausted decades ago, places where the geological conditions created gems that are now considered extremely rare. Victoria had been growing quieter as the examination progressed, her initial skepticism gradually giving way to something that looked uncomfortably like dawning realization. How rare? She asked, though the question seemed to cost her effort to voice. Dr. Valdez consulted her notes,
referencing measurements and test results with information from what appeared to be academic journals and auction records. Based on the size, clarity, and unusual characteristics of this stone, along with the quality of the setting and the apparent age of the piece. She paused, double-checking her calculations. I would estimate a current market value of somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000. The silence that followed felt like the moment after lightning strikes, when the world holds its breath, waiting for the thunder that will confirm what everyone has just witnessed. Maya heard Victoria's sharp intake of breath, saw Helena's professional composure crack just slightly around the edges, felt her own heartbeat accelerate to a rhythm that seemed entirely disconnected from the quiet jewelry store around them. "That's impossible," Victoria said, her voice thin and strained. "You're saying that this little ring, this thing that looks like it came from a second-hand shop, is worth $500,000? Dr. Valdez nodded slowly, her expression serious and certain. The stone alone is extraordinary, combined with the historical significance of the setting and the rarity of pieces from this period and origin. Yes, this is a museum-quality artifact that also happens to be a stunning piece of jewelry." Maya felt the world tilt slightly around her, as if gravity had shifted and she needed to recalibrate her understanding of up and down. The ring that Victoria had mocked as gas station jewelry, that their parents had dismissed as an old woman's confused generosity, was worth more than Maya's salary for the next 15 years, more than the down payment on the house she'd never imagined being able to afford, more than Victoria's engagement ring by a factor of 10. Where could something like this have come from? Maya asked, her voice sounding distant even to herself. Dr. Valdez was studying documentation she'd pulled up on her computer, historical records and auction results that seemed to span decades. Based on the characteristics I'm seeing, this appears to be from a collection that was dispersed during World War II. Many wealthy families in Europe were forced to liquidate their holdings quickly, often selling pieces below market value or smuggling them out through various networks. She looked up at Maya with renewed interest. "Do you know anything about your grandmother's background, where she came from originally?" Maya thought about the stories Nai had told, the ones that had always seemed touched with the romance of memory rather than the precision of historical fact. She talked about leaving China during the war, but she was always vague about the details. She mentioned having to leave everything behind, bringing only what they could carry. "Ah," Dr. Valdez said, her expression brightening with the satisfaction of someone fitting pieces into a puzzle. "That would explain several things. During the 1940s, there was significant movement of valuable items through various routes as people fled conflict zones. Many pieces ended up far from their original homes, carried by refugees who had no choice but to convert their wealth into something portable." She gestured toward the ring, which seemed to have acquired an entirely different presence under the bright lights of the examination area. "Your grandmother may have carried this with her as insurance, something valuable enough to provide security in an uncertain world, but small enough to hide if necessary. The understated setting would have been intentional, designed to avoid attracting attention while preserving the value of an extraordinary stone." Victoria had been silent through this explanation, but I could see her processing the implications with the calculating precision that had always defined her approach to family dynamics. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of something that might have been desperation dressed up as reasonableness. Well, this is fascinating from a historical perspective, but we need to be practical about this. Maya, you can't possibly
Keep something this valuable. I mean, look at your apartment, your car, your lifestyle. You don't have the insurance, the security, the proper storage. This belongs in a museum or a collection where it can be properly protected. Maya turned to look at her sister, seeing Victoria clearly for perhaps the first time in her adult life. The beautiful, accomplished, perfect daughter, who would never wanted for anything, was now staring at a $500,000 ring on Maya's finger with the expression of someone discovering that the universe's accounting had been fundamentally incorrect. "It was given to me," Maya said quietly. "Ninite chose to give it to me." "But she probably didn't know what it was worth," Victoria pressed, her voice taking on the persuasive tone she'd perfected during years of charity work and social climbing. If she'd understood the value, she would have made different arrangements. She would have wanted it to go to someone who could appreciate it properly, someone who understands antiques and historical pieces. Dr. Valdez had been listening to this exchange with the careful neutrality of someone who had witnessed many family discussions about newly discovered wealth. "If I may," she said gently, "there's something else you should consider. The person who originally owned this ring knew exactly what they possessed. The setting is too sophisticated, the stone too carefully selected for this to have been an accidental acquisition." She picked up the ring again, handling it with reverence that seemed appropriate for an artifact worth more than most people's houses. "Your grandmother may not have known the precise dollar value, but she understood that this was something precious, something worth preserving. The fact that she chose to give it to you suggests she believed you would value it appropriately." Maya felt tears threatening for the first time since the examination had begun, not from sadness, but from an emotion she couldn't quite name. It was as if her grandmother's voice was reaching across time to validate choices Maya had made, struggles she had endured, the quiet dignity she had tried to maintain in the face of her family's constant dismissal. "There's one more thing," Dr. Valdez said, consulting her notes again. "Given the historical significance and the rarity of this piece, it should be formally documented. There are registries for artifacts of this caliber, insurance considerations, provenance research that should be completed. This isn't just a piece of jewelry anymore. It's a documented historical artifact." Victoria's composure finally cracked entirely. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising to a pitch that drew attention from other customers in the store. "Maya works at a nonprofit. She drives a 10-year-old Honda. She shops at Target. You're telling me that she's been walking around with a museum piece on her finger like it's some trinket from Claire's?" "Value isn't always obvious," Dr. Valdez said calmly. "Sometimes the most precious things are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone who knows how to recognize them." Maya found herself thinking about the years she'd spent wearing the ring, the comfort she'd drawn from its weight during difficult moments, the way she'd absent-mindedly turned it during stressful meetings or quiet evenings. She'd never thought about its monetary worth, but she'd always sensed its importance, the way it seemed to carry echoes of her grandmother's strength and resilience. Helena had been making notes throughout the examination, preparing documentation that would be required for insurance and legal purposes. "Maya," she said, "I'll need to provide you with a formal appraisal document, and I strongly recommend that you contact your insurance company immediately. A piece of this value requires special coverage." The practical implications were beginning to penetrate the fog of disbelief that had settled over Maya's thoughts. Insurance, security, the target that wearing such a valuable piece would paint on her back. The ring that had been a source of comfort was now a responsibility that felt almost overwhelming in its magnitude.
"Need some air," Maya said, standing abruptly from the chair where she'd been sitting throughout the examination. The jewelry store suddenly felt too small, too bright, too full of implications she wasn't ready to process. Victoria followed her outside, catching up as Maya reached the sidewalk where the afternoon sun seemed too ordinary for a day that had turned her understanding of reality inside out. Maya, wait, we need to talk about this reasonably. Maya turned to face her sister, seeing her with clarity that felt almost surgical in its precision. Victoria's beauty was still intact, her poise still practiced and effective, but there was something desperate in her eyes now, something that suggested the careful architecture of her superiority had developed unexpected cracks. "What do you want to say, Victoria?" "I want to help you," Victoria said, though the words sounded rehearsed rather than spontaneous. "This is a huge responsibility, and you're not equipped to handle it alone. I have connections in the art world, people who understand valuable pieces. We could work together to make sure this gets the attention it deserves." Maya studied her sister's face, reading the subtext that Victoria probably thought she was concealing. The offer of help came with strings attached, ways for Victoria to insert herself into the story and reclaim some measure of control over a situation that had spinning entirely out of her influence. "You want to be involved because you can't stand that I have something you don't," Maya said, surprised by her own directness. Victoria's mask slipped just enough to reveal the calculation underneath. "I want to be involved because this affects the whole family. Do you realize what this means for our reputation, for the questions people will ask about how our grandmother acquired something like this? There are implications here that go beyond just you and your sudden windfall." Maya felt something solidify inside her, a clarity that had been building since the moment Dr. Valdez had announced the ring's value. This wasn't about family reputation or shared responsibility. This was about Victoria's inability to accept that the overlooked sister, the disappointment, the one who had never quite measured up to family standards, was now the possessor of something extraordinary. "The ring was given to me," Maya said, her voice steady and final. "Nai made her choice about who should have it. I'm going to respect that choice." Victoria's composure cracked entirely, revealing the anger and frustration that had been building throughout the afternoon. "You're being ridiculous, Maya. You can't just walk around with a $500,000 ring like it's nothing. You'll get mugged. You'll lose it. You'll damage it because you don't understand how to care for something precious." "Like I've been damaging it for the past 2 years?" Maya asked. "That's different. You didn't know what it was worth then. And what makes you think I can't learn how to take care of it now?" Victoria stared at her for a long moment, and Maya could see her cycling through various arguments, trying to find the combination of logic and emotional manipulation that would restore her position of authority. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the cold precision of someone delivering an ultimatum. "Fine, keep your ring. But don't expect any help from the family when this becomes more complicated than you can handle. And don't expect us to pretend this doesn't change things between us." Maya felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest. Not from humor, but from the sudden lightness that comes from understanding something that had been confusing for years. "Victoria, this doesn't change anything between us. This just makes it impossible to pretend that things were ever different." She walked back into Harrison's jewelry, leaving Victoria standing on the sidewalk with an expression that suggested she was still calculating angles and strategies, still looking for ways to transform this situation into something she could control. Maya found Dr. Valdez carefully packing her instruments, preparing to leave the ring in Helena's care until
Insurance and security arrangements could be made. "Dr. Valdez," Maya said, "I'd like to hire you to do the full provenance research. I want to know everything about this ring's history, where it came from, how my grandmother came to have it. All of it." Dr. Valdez smiled, the expression warm and encouraging. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Pieces like this have stories that deserve to be told. Your grandmother's story, the original owner's story, the journey this ring took to end up on your finger. It's all connected, and it's all worth preserving." Maya nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, but finding it less burdensome than she'd expected. The ring represented more than monetary value. It was a connection to history, to her grandmother's courage, to the strength it had taken to carry something precious through uncertainty and preserve it for future generations. As she filled out paperwork for insurance and documentation,
Maya caught a glimpse of Victoria through the store window, standing beside her car with her phone pressed to her ear. She was probably calling their parents, probably crafting a narrative that would allow the family to maintain their sense of superiority even in the face of this unexpected development. But for the first time in her adult life, Maya found that she didn't care what story Victoria chose to tell, or how their parents decided to interpret this turn of events. She had something that was unquestionably hers, something that connected her to a history larger than the small world of family politics and social positioning. And more importantly, she had the beginning of understanding about who she was when she stopped measuring herself against other people's expectations and started trusting her own instincts about what mattered. The ring would require adjustments to her life, certainly. Better insurance, more careful storage, the kind of security considerations she'd never needed to think about before. But it would also provide opportunities she'd never imagined. The chance to honor her grandmother's memory properly, to learn about family history that had been hidden or forgotten, to understand herself as part of a story much larger and more complex than she'd ever realized. As Maya left Harrison's jewelry that afternoon, she felt the absence of the ring on her finger like a phantom limb. But she also felt something new taking its place. The solid weight of knowing that she was someone worth her grandmother's trust, someone capable of protecting and preserving something precious. And in a family that had always made her feel like she was somehow insufficient, that knowledge felt more valuable than any amount of money. The Chen family Sunday dinner 3 weeks later was a masterpiece of controlled tension, each family member performing their assigned role in a drama that had been fundamentally rewritten, but not yet acknowledged. Maya arrived precisely on time, driving the same 10-year-old Honda that Victoria had mentioned with such disdain, but now wearing a confidence that seemed to fill the spaces around her in ways that made the familiar dining room feel smaller and more cramped. The ring was back on her finger, properly insured now for its appraised value of $550,000, a figure that Dr. Valdez had settled on after completing additional research into comparable pieces sold at recent auctions. Maya had also commissioned a simple gold band to wear over it, a practical measure that disguised its appearance while allowing her to continue carrying her grandmother's gift with her everywhere she went. Victoria had arrived 20 minutes early, a strategic decision that allowed her to position herself as the helpful daughter, consulting with their mother about menu choices and table settings. She wore her engagement ring with the same practiced elegance as always, but the gesture seemed to require more effort now, as if the weight of knowing that Maya's simple band was worth significantly more than her carefully selected diamond had affected the physics of how the ring sat on her hand. Jessica had flown in for
Final semester at Yale, ostensibly for a routine visit, but more likely summoned by Victoria's carefully worded phone calls describing the situation as a family matter requiring mature consideration. She wore their grandmother's pearls with the same unconscious entitlement she'd always displayed, but Maya noticed her touching them more frequently, as if reassuring herself of their continued presence and significance. David and Helen Chen had prepared for this dinner with the strategic precision they brought to all potentially delicate social situations. They'd clearly discussed the approach they would take, the tone they would maintain, the message they intended to deliver about how this unexpected development would be integrated into the family's carefully maintained narrative of success and respectability. The meal began with the same ritualistic politeness that had defined Chen family gatherings for decades, each course accompanied by conversation topics selected for their neutrality and their ability to showcase the family's collective achievements without requiring acknowledgement of any uncomfortable realities. Victoria's wedding planning provided safe territory for discussion. Jessica's upcoming graduation offered opportunities for parental pride, and David's latest business acquisition gave him a platform for the kind of strategic thinking that had built the family's fortune. Maya participated in these conversations with the same attentive politeness she'd always shown, but something fundamental had shifted in her engagement with the performance. She no longer felt the familiar anxiety about measuring up to standards that seemed designed to exclude her, no longer experienced the painful recognition that her own accomplishments would never warrant the same enthusiastic discussion that greeted her sister's conventional successes.
The change in Maya's presence was subtle but unmistakable. A quality of attention that suggested she was observing the family dynamic from a position of anthropological interest rather than desperate participation. She asked thoughtful questions about Victoria's wedding plans without offering the kind of self-deprecating comments about her own single status that had once provided easy entertainment for the table. She congratulated Jessica on her academic achievements without the apologetic undertone that had previously accompanied her praise of accomplishments she would never be positioned to replicate. Chen had clearly planned to address the ring situation during dessert, after sufficient wine had been consumed to soften the edges of what she undoubtedly viewed as a delicate family matter requiring diplomatic resolution. But Maya's new composure seemed to be affecting the carefully orchestrated timing of the evening, creating space for silences that no one seemed quite prepared to fill with the usual repertoire of family conversation. "Maya, darling," Helen finally said, setting down her dessert fork with the deliberate precision of someone preparing to engage with a task they'd been postponing. "Victoria mentioned that you've had some interesting developments with Mother Chen's ring." Maya looked up from her untouched tiramisu, meeting her mother's gaze with the steady attention of someone who was genuinely curious about what direction the conversation would take. "Yes, it's been quite educational." "Educational how?" David asked, his voice carrying the particular tone he used when gathering information for strategic purposes. "I've learned a great deal about Nai-Nai's history that I never knew before," Maya replied, her response offering information without providing the opening for criticism or correction that her family had apparently been expecting. "Dr. Valdez has been researching the ring's provenance, and it's connected to some fascinating historical events." Victoria shifted in her chair, a movement that suggested impatience with Maya's failure to address what everyone presumably understood to be the real subject under discussion. "Maya, we're not talking about a history lesson. We're talking about the..."
Selected diamond had affected the physics of how the ring sat on her hand. Jessica had flown in from her final semester at Yale, ostensibly for a routine visit, but more likely summoned by Victoria's carefully worded phone calls describing the situation as a family matter requiring mature consideration. She wore their grandmother's pearls with the same unconscious entitlement she'd always displayed, but Maya noticed her touching them more frequently, as if reassuring herself of their continued presence and significance. David and Chen had prepared for this dinner with the strategic precision they brought to all potentially delicate social situations. They'd clearly discussed the approach they would take, the tone they would maintain, the message they intended to deliver about how this unexpected development would be integrated into the family's carefully maintained narrative of success and respectability. The meal began with the same ritualistic politeness that had defined Chen family gatherings for decades. Each course accompanied by conversation topics selected for their neutrality and their ability to showcase the family's collective achievements without requiring acknowledgement of any uncomfortable realities. Victoria's wedding planning provided safe territory for discussion. Jessica's upcoming graduation offered opportunities for parental pride, and David's latest business acquisition gave him a platform for the kind of strategic thinking that had built the family's fortune. Maya participated in these conversations with the same attentive politeness she'd always shown. But something fundamental had shifted in her engagement with the performance. She no longer felt the familiar anxiety about measuring up to standards that seemed designed to exclude her, no longer experienced the painful recognition that her own accomplishments would never warrant the same enthusiastic discussion that greeted her sister's conventional successes. The change in Maya's presence was subtle, but unmistakable, a quality of attention that suggested she was observing the family dynamic from a position of anthropological interest rather than desperate participation. She asked thoughtful questions about Victoria's wedding plans, without offering the kind of self-deprecating comments about her own single status that had once provided easy entertainment for the table. She congratulated Jessica on her academic achievements, without the apologetic undertone that had previously accompanied her praise of accomplishments she would never be positioned to replicate. Chen had clearly planned to address the ring situation during dessert, after sufficient wine had been consumed to soften the edges of what she undoubtedly viewed as a delicate family matter requiring diplomatic resolution. But Maya's new composure seemed to be affecting the carefully orchestrated timing of the evening, creating space for silences that no one seemed quite prepared to fill with the usual repertoire of family conversation. "Maya, darling," Helen finally said, setting down her dessert fork with the deliberate precision of someone preparing to engage with a task they'd been postponing. "Victoria mentioned that you've had some interesting developments with Mother Chen's ring." Maya looked up from her untouched tiramisu, meeting her mother's gaze with the steady attention of someone who was genuinely curious about what direction the conversation would take. "Yes, it's been quite educational." "Educational how?" David asked, his voice carrying the particular tone he used when gathering information for strategic purposes. "I've learned a great deal about Nai's history that I never knew before," Maya replied, her response offering information without providing the opening for criticism or correction that her family had apparently been expecting. "Dr. Valdez has been researching the ring's provenance, and it's connected to some fascinating historical events." Victoria shifted in her chair, a movement that suggested impatience with Maya's failure to address what everyone presumably understood to be the real subject under discussion. "Maya, we're not talking about a history lesson. We're talking about the fact that you're walking around with something worth more than most people's houses." "Am I walking around with it?" Maya asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "I'm sitting at dinner with my family, wearing a ring my grandmother gave me. The same ring I've worn to every family dinner for the past 2 years. The only thing that's changed is that now we know what it's worth." Jessica leaned forward, her expression carrying the earnest concern of someone who believed she was approaching a complex problem with mature insight. "But Maya, knowing what it's worth changes everything about the responsibility you have toward it. It's not just a piece of family jewelry anymore. It's like carrying around a Picasso painting." "Is it? Or is it like wearing a ring that my grandmother specifically chose to give to me because she trusted me to value it appropriately?" The question hung in the air with the particular weight of a statement that challenges assumptions without providing easy targets for counter-argument. Chen's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, the kind of subtle reaction that suggested Maya's response had not followed the script that had been prepared for this conversation. "Darling, no one is questioning Nai's intentions," Helen said, her voice carrying the careful patience of someone explaining obvious realities to a child who was being deliberately obstinate. "But we have to be realistic about practical considerations. The insurance alone must be costing you a fortune." "Actually, it's quite reasonable," Maya replied. "Dr. Valdez recommended a specialist insurer who works with collectors and museums. The premium is less than what most people pay for car insurance." David set down his wine glass with enough force to create a small sound of crystal against wood, a gesture that suggested his patience with diplomatic approaches was reaching its limits. "Maya, let's stop dancing around this. You can't possibly intend to continue wearing something that valuable in your daily life. It's impractical, it's dangerous, and frankly, it's irresponsible." Maya studied her father's face, seeing the familiar combination of authority and certainty that had defined his approach to family management throughout her childhood. But instead of the automatic deference she had once shown to his pronouncements, she found herself genuinely interested in understanding the logic behind his position. Dangerous how? You could be robbed, attacked, targeted by criminals who know what you're carrying. You live alone in that neighborhood. You take public transportation. You work with people who probably haven't seen that kind of money in their entire lives. You're making yourself a target. "So your advice is that I should hide something valuable because other people might want to take it from me?" My advice is that you should be realistic about your circumstances and make responsible decisions about protecting assets that belong to the family. The phrase belong to the family seemed to echo in the dining room with particular resonance, as if David had finally articulated the assumption that had been underlying the entire conversation. "The ring belongs to me," Maya said quietly. "Nine gave it to me. She specifically chose me to have it." Victoria's composure finally cracked entirely, revealing the frustration that had been building throughout weeks of watching Maya navigate her new circumstances with confidence rather than the overwhelming gratitude Victoria had apparently expected. "Maya, you're being incredibly selfish about this. This ring has historical significance, cultural value that goes beyond any one person's attachment to it. It should be in a museum where people can appreciate it properly, where it can be studied and preserved for future generations. Like you wanted?"
To preserve it when you thought it was worthless, Maya asked. The question struck with surgical precision, cutting through the elaborate rationalization Victoria had constructed around her current position. For a moment, the dining room was silent, except for the sound of the antique clock in the corner, marking time with the steady rhythm of something that had witnessed many family confrontations and would undoubtedly witness many more. Jessica attempted to bridge the growing chasm with the kind of diplomatic intervention she'd learned in her international relations courses. "I think what Victoria means is that now that we understand the ring's true significance, we have an obligation to consider what would be best for preserving its historical value. And you've all decided that what would be best is for me not to have it?" Maya said, though her tone carried more observation than accusation. Chen had been growing visibly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken, clearly preferring the indirect approach that allowed family disputes to be resolved through suggestion and implication, rather than direct confrontation. "Maya, sweetie, no one wants to take anything away from you. We just want to make sure you're thinking about all the implications of keeping something so valuable." "What implications haven't I considered?" "Well, for instance," Helen said, seeming to warm to territory that felt more manageable than direct demands, "have you thought about how this affects your insurance situation, your living arrangements, your overall security profile? You might need to move to a safer neighborhood, invest in a security system, change your entire lifestyle to accommodate the reality of owning something like this." Maya nodded thoughtfully, as if considering these points for the first time. "You're right that it requires some adjustments. I have already upgraded my apartment's security system, and I'm working with a jeweler to have a replica made for everyday wear while keeping the original in a safe deposit box except for special occasions." The practical competence of Maya's response seemed to deflate some of the urgency around the family's concerns, removing the foundation for arguments based on her presumed inability to handle sophisticated responsibilities. Victoria looked particularly frustrated by this development, as if Maya's demonstration of practical capability had undermined a key element of the case for family intervention. "But why keep it at all?" Victoria pressed. "I mean, what are you actually going to do with a ring worth $500,000? You're not going to wear it to work at the community center. You're not going to show it off at charity galas. You don't move in circles where people would appreciate or understand what you have." Maya felt a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, not from amusement, but from the clarity that came with finally understanding what this conversation was really about. "You're absolutely right, Victoria. I don't move in circles where people care about $500,000 rings. I work with families who are struggling to pay rent, who are trying to find jobs that will support their children, who measure wealth in terms of having enough groceries for the week." "Exactly," Victoria said, as if Maya had just proven her point. "So what's the purpose of keeping something that has no relevance to your actual life?" "The purpose," Maya said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, "is that it's mine.
It was given to me by someone who loved me, who trusted me, who wanted me to have something precious that connected me to our family's history. The fact that you can't understand why that matters to me says more about your values than it does about my judgment." David had been listening to this exchange with growing impatience, clearly frustrated by his inability to apply the kind of logical pressure that had always been effective in business negotiations. "Maya, you're being emotional about this instead of rational. No one is questioning your grandmother's affection for you, but affection doesn't qualify someone to be the custodian of a historically significant artifact."
"What would qualify me?" Maya asked. "Understanding its value, having the resources to protect it properly, moving in communities where its significance would be appreciated and preserved," David replied, as if these qualifications were self-evident. "So basically, being more like Victoria." David's pause confirmed what Maya had suspected from the beginning of the conversation. The family's concerns about insurance and security and historical preservation were elaborate constructions built around a simpler reality. They could not accept that Maya, the overlooked daughter who had never quite measured up to family standards, was now the possessor of something they considered themselves more worthy to own. "Maya," Helen said, her voice taking on the tone of someone preparing to deliver difficult news with appropriate sensitivity, "we've been talking as a family about options that might work for everyone. Victoria and Bradley have offered to take responsibility for the ring's care and preservation. They have the insurance, the security, the social connections that would ensure it's properly valued and protected." Maya looked around the table, studying the faces of her family members and seeing clearly for the first time the coordinated nature of this intervention. Victoria's satisfied expression, Jessica's apologetic discomfort, their parents' careful presentation of a solution they had obviously discussed in advance. The ring had become a family project, and Maya's role in that project was to gracefully surrender her claim to something she was presumed incompetent to handle. "Let me understand this correctly," Maya said. "You want me to give my grandmother's ring to Victoria so that she can wear it to charity galas and cocktail parties where people will properly appreciate its value? We want you to consider what would be best for preserving something that clearly has significance beyond any individual owner," Helen replied, though her careful phrasing couldn't entirely disguise the presumption underlying the request. Maya stood up from the table, her movement sudden enough to startle Jessica, who had been nervously playing with their grandmother's pearls throughout the conversation. The dining room seemed to contract around Maya's presence as if her physical elevation had shifted the power dynamics in ways that made everyone else uncomfortable. "Dr. Valdez completed her provenance research last week," Maya said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to share important information. "The ring belonged to the Empress Dowager Cixi's personal collection. It was given to my great-great-grandmother as payment for services provided to the imperial court during a period of political upheaval in the 1890s. The silence that followed this announcement was complete, broken only by the continued ticking of the antique clock and the sound of Victoria's sharp intake of breath. Mai could see her family processing the implications of this information, understanding that they were not discussing a valuable antique, but a piece of Chinese imperial history that had somehow survived revolutions, wars, and decades of displacement to end up in their dining room. My great-great-grandmother carried it with her when she fled China during the political chaos that followed the Boxer Rebellion. She traded pieces of her other jewelry for passage to America, but she kept this ring because it represented more than monetary value. It was proof of her family's service to the empire, evidence of honor that transcended political circumstances." Jessica had stopped fidgeting with the pearls, her attention entirely focused on Maya's recitation of family history that none of them had ever heard before. Victoria's expression had shifted from satisfaction to something approaching alarm, as if she was beginning to understand that the conversation had moved far beyond the scope of what she had prepared for. "She passed it to my great-grandmother, who wore it while working in laundries, factories, to support her family in a country that didn't welcome Chinese immigrants," Maya said. "She passed it to my grandmother, who wore it during the Japanese occupation, through the Communist Revolution, during the journey that brought her to America with nothing but the clothes on her back and the few pieces of jewelry she could hide in the lining of her coat. Maya looked directly at her father, seeing something in his expression that suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had been casually discussing as a matter of practical family management. Nainai didn't give me this ring because she thought I needed expensive jewelry. She gave it to me because she recognized something in me that reminded her of the women who carried it before me. Women who preserved something precious through circumstances that threatened to destroy everything they valued. David Chen had built his career on his ability to assess situations quickly and adjust his strategies accordingly. But Maya could see him struggling to recalibrate his approach to a conversation that had revealed depths he hadn't anticipated. Maya, if this is true, if the ring has this kind of historical significance, then it's even more important that it be properly preserved and protected. It has been properly preserved and protected, Maya replied, for over a century, by women who understood its value in ways that had nothing to do with insurance appraisals or museum displays. Women who knew that some things are worth preserving not because of their monetary value, but because of what they represent, about survival, dignity, and the courage to carry something beautiful through difficult circumstances. Victoria had been growing increasingly agitated throughout Maya's recitation, clearly frustrated by the transformation of what should have been a simple discussion about practical responsibilities into something that seemed to be expanding beyond her ability to control or redirect. Maya, you're romanticizing this. Yes, it's a beautiful family story, but that doesn't change the reality that you're not equipped to be the custodian of something with this kind of historical and cultural significance. What would equip me? Maya asked again. Education, resources, connections in the academic and cultural communities that study these kinds of artifacts, Victoria replied, her voice gaining confidence as she moved back to territory that felt more familiar. I have contacts at several museums, relationships with people who specialize in Asian art and imperial Chinese artifacts. I could ensure that this ring gets the scholarly attention it deserves. Maya nodded, as if considering this argument seriously. So you think the ring should go to someone who has the right connections to ensure it receives proper scholarly attention? Exactly. Dr. Valdez disagrees with you. Victoria's confident expression faltered slightly. What do you mean? Maya reached into her purse and withdrew a folder that contained Dr. Valdez's completed research report, along with correspondence from several academic institutions and museums that had learned about the ring's existence through professional networks that Maya was only beginning to understand. Dr. Valdez has been in contact with the Smithsonian, the Metropolitan Museum, and the Museum of Chinese in America. They're all interested in documenting the ring's history, but none of them think it should be removed from the family that has preserved it for over a century. She opened the folder and began reading from a letter that bore the official letterhead of the Smithsonian Institution. Quote, "The preservation of this artifact within the family line that has maintained its integrity for multiple generations represents the ideal stewardship model for pieces of this historical significance. The continuity of family ownership ensures that the cultural and personal significance of the piece remains connected to its material value, creating a more complete historical record than would be possible if the artifact were separated from its familial context."
Her family staring at her with expressions that ranged from bewilderment to something approaching awe. The quiet daughter who had never quite fit into their carefully constructed narrative of success and achievement was quoting correspondence from the Smithsonian Institution about proper stewardship of imperial Chinese artifacts. "There's more," Maya said, turning to another letter. "The Museum of Chinese in America has invited me to participate in an upcoming exhibition about Chinese immigrant families and the cultural artifacts they preserve during periods of displacement and persecution. They want to include the ring as part of a display about the strategies families use to maintain connections to their heritage while adapting to new countries and circumstances." Jessica was the first to find her voice, though it came out smaller and more uncertain than her usual confident tone. "Maya, this is incredible. You're going to be in a museum exhibition? The ring is going to be in the exhibition, Maya corrected gently. I'm going to be the family representative who provides historical context and personal testimony about what the ring has meant to the women who owned it. Victoria's face had gone through several color changes during this revelation, settling on a pale shade that suggested she was beginning to understand that her carefully planned intervention had not only failed, but had revealed the extent to which she had misunderstood both Maya's capabilities and the actual nature of what they were discussing. You never mentioned any of this, Helen said, her voice carrying a note of accusation that suggested she felt Maya had deliberately withheld information that would have changed the family's approach to the situation. You never asked, Maya replied simply. Every conversation we've had about the ring has been focused on why I shouldn't have it, not on what I was doing with the opportunity to have it. David Chen had been silent throughout this latest development, but Maya could see him processing the implications with the same strategic thinking he brought to complex business problems. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a different quality than it had at the beginning of the evening, less certainty and more genuine curiosity. Maya, help me understand something. When did you become someone who corresponds with museums and academic institutions? When did you develop expertise in cultural preservation and historical documentation? Maya felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest, not from amusement, but from the absurdity of the question and what it revealed about her family's understanding of who she was and what she was capable of becoming. I became that person the moment I decided to find out the truth about something that mattered to me, instead of accepting other people's assumptions about its value. She closed the folder and returned it to her purse, the gesture carrying a finality that suggested the evening's revelations had reached their conclusion. I've spent 3 weeks learning about Imperial Chinese history, about the political circumstances that forced my great-great-grandmother to leave everything she knew, about the networks of families and institutions that preserved cultural artifacts through periods when preservation seemed impossible. Maya looked around the table, meeting each family member's gaze with the confidence of someone who had discovered something important about herself and was no longer willing to pretend otherwise. I've learned that the ring isn't just valuable because of what it's worth at auction. It's valuable because it represents an unbroken chain of women who understood that some things are worth preserving even when everything else is falling apart. Victoria made one final attempt to regain control of a conversation that had completely escaped her management. Maya, this is all very impressive, but it doesn't change the practical realities of ownership. You still don't have the resources or the lifestyle that would make you an appropriate long-term custodian for something this significant.
Maya stood up from the table again, this time with the deliberate movement of someone preparing to leave rather than make a point. Victoria, you're absolutely right. I don't have the resources or lifestyle that you think are appropriate for owning something like this. I live in a modest apartment, I drive an old car, I work at a nonprofit helping families who are struggling with problems that your social circle doesn't consider interesting or important. She picked up her purse and moved toward the dining room doorway, pausing to deliver what felt like a closing statement rather than a continuation of the argument. But what I do have is the ability to recognize value that doesn't announce itself, to appreciate significance that doesn't require external validation, and to understand that being chosen as the keeper of something precious is a responsibility that has nothing to do with whether other people think you deserve it. Maya turned to leave, then stopped and faced her family one more time. Nai gave me this ring because she saw something in me that you've never been able to see. She understood that I was someone who would value it for the right reasons, someone who would take the time to learn its history and honor the women who preserved it before me. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier pauses in the conversation, heavier with recognition that something fundamental had shifted in the family dynamic. Maya could see her parents and sisters processing not just the information she had shared about the ring's history and her involvement with academic institutions, but the reality that she had become someone who moved confidently in worlds they hadn't known she had access to. "Maya, wait," Jessica said, her voice carrying genuine confusion rather than strategic positioning. "I don't understand what just happened here. When did you become this person who knows about museums and Imperial Chinese history? When did you start talking to people at the Smithsonian?"
Maya paused in the doorway, considering how to answer a question that seemed to contain genuine curiosity rather than the barely disguised criticism that had characterized most of the evening's interactions. I became this person when I decided to stop waiting for permission to be interested in things that matter to me. When I stopped assuming that I wasn't smart enough or educated enough or connected enough to learn about subjects that seemed important. She looked directly at Jessica, seeing something in her youngest sister's expression that suggested genuine surprise rather than strategic calculation. The people at the Smithsonian don't care that I work at a nonprofit or drive an old car or shop at Target. They care that I have access to a historically significant artifact and that I'm committed to learning about it properly and sharing that knowledge with people who can benefit from it. David Chen had been listening to this exchange with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had revealed pieces he hadn't known existed. Maya, I have to ask, why didn't you tell us about any of this? Why didn't you share what you were learning, what you were discovering about the family history? Maya considered the question seriously, recognizing that it came from a place of genuine confusion rather than accusation. Because every conversation we've had about the ring has started with the assumption that I was doing something wrong by having it. Every discussion has been about why I shouldn't keep it, why I wasn't qualified to own it, why it would be better off with someone else. She shifted her purse to her other shoulder, a small gesture that seemed to signal her readiness to leave, but also her willingness to provide one final explanation. You can't expect someone to share their discoveries and accomplishments with people who have already decided that they're not capable of having discoveries and accomplishments. Helen Chen had been growing increasingly uncomfortable throughout the evening as the conversation had moved further and further away from the script she had apparently prepared for managing this family situation.
Maya, darling, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. We weren't trying to criticize your capabilities. We were concerned about the practical aspects of owning something so valuable. Were you? Maya asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Or were you concerned about the family's reputation if word got out that the overlooked daughter was walking around with something worth more than Victoria's engagement ring? The accuracy of this assessment seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Impossible to deny, but too uncomfortable to acknowledge directly. Maya could see her family exchanging glances, each of them apparently hoping that someone else would find a way to respond to an observation that had cut through all the elaborate justifications they had constructed around their intervention. Maya, Victoria said finally, her voice carrying less authority than it had at the beginning of the evening, but still maintaining the tone of someone who believed she understood the situation better than anyone else. I think you're being unfair. We're a family. When one of us has something significant happen, it affects all of us. We were trying to help you think through the implications. Maya nodded as if accepting this explanation at face value. You are absolutely right, Victoria. This does affect all of you. It affects your understanding of who I am, what I'm capable of, and what role I play in this family. It affects your assumption that you're the only ones with connections to important institutions and interesting opportunities. She moved closer to the table, her presence seeming to fill the dining room in ways that made everyone else lean back slightly in their chairs. Most importantly, it affects your belief that value and worth are things that announce themselves in ways you've learned to recognize. Sometimes, the most precious things are hidden in plain sight, carried by people you've trained yourself not to see clearly. Maya reached into her purse and withdrew a small velvet box, setting it on the table in front of Victoria with the careful precision of someone making a final point. Dr. Valdez had this made for me while she was completing her research. It's an exact replica of the ring, created by artisans who specialize in historical reproductions for museums and collectors. Victoria opened the box with obvious curiosity, revealing a ring that was virtually identical to the one Maya wore, perfect in every detail, except for the microscopic engraving on the inside of the band that identified it as a reproduction.
The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the attention to detail so complete that even side by side, the replica and the original would be difficult to distinguish without sophisticated testing equipment. "This," Maya said, "is what a valuable ring looks like when it's designed to be noticed and admired. Perfect, flawless, obviously expensive, everything you would expect from something worth a significant amount of money." She gestured toward the ring on her own finger, its surface showing the subtle signs of age and wear that came from being handled by generations of women who had valued it enough to keep it close rather than protected in a vault. "And this is what a priceless ring looks like when it's designed to survive, to be carried through circumstances that would destroy anything that announced its value too loudly." Maya picked up the replica and handed it to Victoria, who accepted it with the automatic politeness of someone who wasn't sure what was being offered. "Maya, I don't understand what you're trying to say." "I'm trying to say that you've spent this entire evening explaining why you would be a better custodian for something precious than I would be, based on your assumption that value should be displayed and appreciated by people who have been trained to recognize its monetary value."
"Recognize it properly," Maya said. "But the ring I inherited wasn't preserved for over a century by women who displayed it at social gatherings. It was preserved by women who understood that sometimes the most important things need to be protected by being hidden, carried quietly, valued privately." Maya moved toward the dining room exit again, this time with the definitive movement of someone who had finished saying everything that needed to be said. "Keep the replica, Victoria. Wear it to your wedding, show it off at cocktail parties. Let people admire its obvious beauty and perfect craftsmanship. Let it represent everything you think a valuable ring should be." She paused at the threshold, looking back at her family one final time. "But understand that the difference between the ring you're holding and the one I'm wearing isn't just about monetary value or historical significance. It's about the difference between something that exists to be admired and something that exists to be treasured, between something that announces its worth to strangers and something that reveals its meaning only to people who have earned the right to understand it." Maya left the Chen family home that evening with the same quiet dignity she had always possessed, but now accompanied by a confidence that seemed to transform everything around her. The modest Honda, the simple clothes, the unassuming apartment she was returning to, all of these remained unchanged, but they no longer felt like evidence of her failure to meet family expectations. Instead, they felt like choices made by someone who understood the difference between appearance and substance, between being valued and being valuable. As she drove through the familiar streets toward her own neighborhood, Maya found herself thinking about her grandmother's stories, the ones that had always seemed touched with romance and embellishment, but which she now understood to be historical accounts of extraordinary courage and determination. Nainai had carried something precious through circumstances designed to destroy everything valuable, not because she was seeking attention or admiration, but because she understood that some things were worth preserving, regardless of whether anyone else recognized their importance. Maya had spent most of her adult life believing that her family's dismissal of her choices and achievements reflected some fundamental inadequacy on her part, some failure to develop the qualities that commanded respect and recognition. But wearing her grandmother's ring had taught her that worth existed independent of external validation, that significance could be carried quietly and privately, and that sometimes the most precious things were preserved by people who understood their value in ways that couldn't be measured by conventional standards. The ring had revealed more than its own history during the weeks of research and discovery that followed Dr. Valdez's initial appraisal. It had revealed Maya's capacity for scholarly investigation, her ability to form connections with academic and cultural institutions, her talent for understanding and communicating complex historical narratives. Most importantly, it had revealed her right to occupy space in conversations about valuable and important things,
not because of her family connections or social position, but because of her genuine commitment to learning and preserving something that mattered.
Room she occupied. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just clip and check them out.